All right, we're going to continue our look into absolutism and the Bourbons. We'll look at Louis XIV as the absolute ruler, and epitomized absolutism more than any other. And so we're going to look specifically at how Louis XIV was implemented his system of absolutism in France. Louis XIV, as you can see, one of the things he did was he took advantage of the robe nobility. Of appointing people into his bureaucracy. The expansion of his bureaucracy allowed him to control his territory, while at the same time preventing nobles from having control. So as you can see, the quote there, right there, is that people know by the rank of men who serve him that he had no intention of sharing power with them. And we're also going to talk a little bit, when we look at the culture of absolutism, how he was able to pacify the nobles and basically place them in a position where they had title, but they really didn't have any real political power. He never shares that power with the Estates Generals. The Estates Generals, the meaning of the three estates of France, the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate being everyone else, never shared that throughout his time in power. In fact, the next Estates General to be called will be at the eve of the French Revolution, even though the States General dates back to the Capetian dynasty in the Middle Ages. He had a secret police he used to enforce his will, and so no one ever really knew who was in the secret police, so you never knew when the king was essentially watching or listening to your conversations. And one of the last things he did is, once he felt that he had solidified control of France and he felt truly in power, he went back and undid what Henry IV did in the Edict of Nantes. And by issuing the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, he essentially revoked the religious toleration, the Edict of Nantes, closed down some Protestant churches, sent many Huguenots, especially influential Huguenots, into exile, and for his view was that religion was a matter of state, and as the king is the head of the Catholic Church in France, that people should follow that Catholic Church. And he was able to effectively at least enforce that to an extent, although there were still people that were Protestants within France. So one of the debates we're going to talk about when I come back, and in your notes I'd like you to jot down your opinions from your reading of Mackay, and from our discussion and from the sources that you've looked at. I want you to just take a stance and decide whether you think Louis XIV was his absolutism a full and true absolutist state, or was he in a negotiation with traditional noble power? And we're going to try to look at both sides of that argument. Some historians have said in reality he made many compromises with the nobility. The past historians have also argued that he completely puts down the nobility and strips them of all power. So we're going to actually try to get into that debate and see which is true and which is not. One of the things that Louis XIV does is he really wants France to compete, and we talked about in the wars of religion how France, these wars of religion prevent them from really competing with the commercial revolution that's going on, with other powers that are going through that. They're not competing with the colonization, the new trade, and the commercial goods that are coming in from that trade. So it puts them at a disadvantage economically. So one of the things that he does as his financial minister, he appoints Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and his role was to, for all intents and purposes, to make France a new commercial power and to make them a colonial power as well. So what it does is the French decide under Colbert to apply a system of mercantilism, keeping in mind the goal of mercantilism is to weaken your competitors. You want to outcompete them economically. You want to foster your own industry at home. So part of mercantilism is protectionism. You want to protect your own economies. You want to create new forms of commercial activity. And you want to, at the same time, expand using colonies abroad to bring goods in which you trade to other European powers in exchange for precious metals. So what it did was the government started to subsidize and support new industries. So they would give money to new industries that were being developed. shipping industries, manufacturing industries. They sent inspectors out. They put in tariffs on foreign goods to prevent people from buying foreign goods. So tariffs are a way to basically artificially increase the price of those goods coming in. So you buy French goods rather than buying English goods. You want to reduce domestic tariffs to reduce the prices. So taxes on domestically produced goods, they would be reduced to keep the price low on them. So the point is to encourage people to buy goods produced in France, discourage people from buying goods from outside of France. And lastly, Colbert was also sought to encourage immigration to France, of people who could bring wealth in, and also to bring in people who were engaged in other industries elsewhere, so you could kind of develop those industries within your own country. So Colbert's administration as a foreign minister for France really propels France to a colonial and mercantilist power. What you see here is the French start to involve in exploring and colonizing in the Americas, but they're coming in late. So if you keep in mind that in Spanish exploration, Portuguese exploration, there was a lot of colonization going on in Central and South America. The players that come in late, England, France, that are really coming in the 1600s, they start to focus more on North America for colonization there. And for the French, it's mostly along the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, and along the Mississippi River Valley. There isn't a huge amount of French colonization there as far as colonists coming over and settling. When you think of French colonies in English colonies in North America, Jamestown and beyond, the English settled in large numbers in their North American colonies. The French really kind of came over, for the most part, to trade for furs and to bring goods like that they could sell in the European market. There were a couple of major French forts: Quebec, Montreal, New Orleans. Those all come a little bit later, and there are just a few examples of fort cities that actually become settlement cities. For the most part, a few numbers of French came over actually to trade those goods. So there's a difference in the colonization model of the English and the French, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. One of the other things that Colbert also tried to establish is that a more efficient collection of taxes. Louis XIV always had a problem with money. His inability to raise enough money for how much money he was spending. He's going to be involved in a lot of wars of expansion. He's going to exempt the nobility from paying taxes. So essentially, there's a few taxes, but they're very few far between. They're very small. So for the most part, the second estate is pretty much tax-free, and so is the first estate. So you have the largest amount of wealth in France that's basically being exempt from taxes, and he's spending greatly on wars and on his own administration. So he always has a problem with money. So Colbert wants to find a way to be more efficient in the collection of taxes, but sometimes what that means is that he's going to be taxing more from the third estate. There is wealth in the third estate with the commercial revolution. You got a growing bourgeois class that has money, but there's also the majority of the population is still peasantry in France. They have very little to give. So when you're asking them to give more, this creates a potential disaster for France. And that question is posed in this slide because at the expense of absolutism and the system of the estates creates France's inability to collect taxes effectively and pay for its government, and it's going to lead to debt, which is going to be a major cause of the French Revolution. So linking on that, Louis XIV was definitely a wartime king. The quote from your reading that I've gone ahead and put in the slide here: "The character of a conqueror is regarded as the noblest and highest of titles," I think really sums it up. Louis XIV was really interested in expanding his territory. And if you look at the fact that France was at war for 33 of his 54 years of his personal rule, really tells you that. The problem with this was you had to deal with maintaining a large army, constantly filling those ranks. And there were a lot of ways that was done. Some people were joined the army on their own accord. Some people were conscripted. Some people were forced into joining the army. But in all that, the armies cost a lot of money, and it's going to put them in a lot of debt. And in reality, Louis XIV never really adds that much territory to his empire, which we'll actually see. For 33 years of warfare and all the expense, there's a relatively small payout for Louis XIV to his expansion on France. As you can see in this next slide, the territory gained by Louis XIV. Louis always thought that France had a natural right to more areas in Western Europe than probably the rest of Europe believed it had. But you could see for the expense of his wars and the amount of people who died in those wars and that constant 30-year wars of fighting, relatively small area is added onto France by Louis XIV. So a lot of historians write about how absolutism creates more warfare. There is some reality in that when you have one person in power who's ambitious, it's going to force his country to war, and people are going to agree with that. But as we're going to see, the constitutional systems will engage in some warfare, and that's going to be really a theme. And maybe you should start this in your notes. An important theme of the 16 and 1700s is we're going to see the growth of the numbers of wars and the size of wars in Europe. And we're going to see what we refer to as continental wars, wars that occur across the continent involving multiple countries, much like what we saw in the 30 Years' War, as a product of this time period. So with France being this most populous country in Western Europe and its potential to be a very powerful country, that made the rest of Europe and European countries quite nervous. And so Louis always argued that these wars were defensive, but the rest of Europe saw them for what they really were. They were expansive. Louis always said that this was his territory, that he was always threatened on his borders, that he had to defend his territory, but in reality he's trying to add to it. And I think that's an accurate historical view. I think in the end we look at the rest of the powers of Europe, seeing Louis for really what he is. And so oftentimes to counteract the power and size of France, that other international players formed coalitions in order to resist that strength. And so what this ended up creating was fighting would be very large. France would be facing large enemies. This would create financial burdens for France. And what we're going to see is France is going to experience bad harvests, like the much of the rest of Europe in the 17th century, and this always places France on the verge of disaster. And that's one of the legacies of Louis XIV and his absolutism, is warfare and debt. And Louis XIV is able to escape it. Louis XV is going to have problems with it, and certainly Louis XVI is going to deal with it when that really comes to fruition. And we're going to see that lead to revolution as well. And the formation of these coalitions are only going to make these wars larger. Again, that's a theme of the 1600s, 1700s, is we're not going to see one country fight another country. We're going to see collections of countries, allies really fighting another, and which is a precursor of what we see in the 1800s, and certainly what we see in the 20th century. Louis XIV, a great example of this war's expansion is actually the War of Spanish Succession, which we'll stop at this part right now. And in the next video clip, we are going to look at that case point of the War of Spanish Succession, how Louis XIV's desires to expand his power led to large-scale war, and really a continental war on the European stage. And we will also examine the culture of Louis XIV's absolutism.